Hey guys, welcome back. We continue building our Django application, and today we're going to cover how to write automated tests in Django. If you haven't seen the previous videos, you can find them linked up here. So far we already built out quite a bit of our application, but we didn't write any tests, so we're going to cover that today. Let's get right into it. At this point we developed our application and we wrote some code to make our application work properly, but we didn't add any tests yet. And tests can be very useful to ensure that our application is bug-free, and we can also use it to ensure that our application does not break when we add additional features to it. And we actually do have a bug in our application, which we can see if we head over to our terminal and we open the Python shell by typing out python manage-py shell. And this allows us to access our database. And first we need to import the datetime module. And then we're going to import the time zone module and also our question class from our models module. Then we're going to create an instance of our question class, which has a publication date 30 days in the future. And we're going to store that in future question. We can now call the method was published recently to see if this question was published recently. And since it's 30 days in the future, of course, it was not published yet. But if we confirm, we can see we get back true. So this is wrong and we need to address this bug. And to ensure that this bug does not occur again and to identify it automatically, we are going to create a test case. For that, Django provides a tests module, tests.py, which is automatically generated with each new app that we generate. And when we start our tests, Django would automatically check for tests inside of tests.py. So let's go ahead and write out our test case. So to set up our tests, we are creating a new class, which we call question model test, which inherits from test case. That's very important in order for this to work properly. And then we are defining a method which starts with test, because Django is always going to check if there is a method in here starting with test, and then that will be executed when we run our test. And here we are calling it test was published recently with future question. And then we are specifying a variable time, which is a time 30 days in the future. We are creating a new instance of the question class object with that future date. And then we are using the assert method to assert that if we call was published recently on our future question, that this is equal to false. And in order for our tests to work properly, we need to make sure that we import the test case class here at the top and also the time zone module. And of course, since we are instantiating our question, we also need to import the question class from our models module. Now with this in place, let's save this and let's head back to our terminal. And to run our tests for our polls application, we're going to type in python manage.py test and then the name of our application, so polls. Let's confirm, and we can see that we ran one test and then our test failed. So we had one failure here, and the error is actually an assertion error that true is not false. So here when we run assert is, we are asserting that was published recently on future question returns false, but as we saw before, it returns true, and therefore we get this kind of error. So this is how we can check this particular case here running our test suite. And specifically when we run these tests, the following is happening. The command python manage-py test polls is going to look for tests in the polls application. Inside of the tests module here, inside of the polls application, Django then finds a subclass of the test case class, in this case question model tests, and it's going to create a special database for testing purposes. And then it's looking for methods inside of our test class, and those tests always need to start with test. And since it identifies that, then of course the code inside of our method is going to be executed. So in this test database, we are setting up this new question with the future publication date, and we are running the assert method to check if running was published recently returns true or false. And then at the end it returns true or false based on the assert statement here, and our test either passes or it fails. Now that we identified that we have an error here, we of course should fix it. For that we can head over to our models.py file, and we need to fix our method was published recently. So here we are currently only checking if the publication date is greater than the difference between the current time and 1 day ago. So here we need to make an addition, and we ensure that the publication date is also less than or equal to the current time. And just to make that a little bit shorter, we are creating a new variable now, which we set equal to the return value of calling now on the time zone. Now with these changes in place, let's head back to our terminal And here we can issue the same command as before to run our tests again. And now we can see that again we ran our one test, but the status is okay, so we don't have any failing tests anymore. We should, however, also add additional test cases to cover the case that we have an old question that's older than 1 day, and also the case that we have a question with a publication date which is very recent. So for that we're going to add 2 more test cases. The first one here is test was published recently with old question. Note that we also start the name with test to make sure that it is properly included when we run our tests. And here we are setting the time variable equal to the difference between the current time and the time of 1 day and 1 second ago. So in that case we expect that our method was published recently returns false because the time difference is more than 1 day. And then of course we have the next test case here where we are testing that our question was published recently within the time interval. So here we are setting the time variable to the difference between the current time and 23 hours, 59 minutes and 59 seconds ago. And here we are expecting that calling was published recently returns true because it's a time interval of 1 day or less. Let's make sure that our tests run properly by heading back to our terminal. And if we run the tests again, we can see that we are now running all 3 tests and all of them worked properly. Now at this point we tested our model and we ensured that our tests identify whether there's a bug when we create a new entry in our database. However, our view where we display the questions currently does not check whether a question is published in the future, and it would display it right away. And we want to ensure that the question whose publication date is in the future will be invisible until that time arrives. So we need to ensure that we have a test on our view level, and for that Django provides a couple of tools. Let's have a look at the first one. So we can open the terminal and we can access our Python shell. And inside of our Python shell, we are going to make sure that we import the setup test environment module. And then we are going to call setup test environment. And this is going to install a template renderer, which allows us to examine some additional attributes on responses that otherwise wouldn't be available. So this method here does not set up a new test environment, which means we can work on the same data we have in our database. After that, we need to import the test client class, and we're going to instantiate it in an object which we call client. Now with that in place, we can use the client to do some work for us. Here we are first going to get a response from the root path, and we get back that the root path could not be found. So let's have a look at the status code of the response object, and we see that we get back a 404. And that's of course we don't have a root path at the moment. We were working from the Polls app subdirectory. But we should be able to find the path if we search from the Polls path. So let's have a look at that. We are first going to import the reverse method, and then we are searching for the path of the index page. And again, we are using the namespace for polls, which we included before to differentiate it from other apps that we might include in the future. Let's have a look at the status code for response, and we get back 200, which means that this URL exists and we could retrieve it properly. We can also call content on response to get an overview of the actual content of that page. So these are basically the different questions that we created before, which are listed here. And we can also reference the latest question list here. So here we get back a query set, which includes the 2 questions that we created before. So what's your favorite programming language and what's up? But at the moment we have the problem that also those questions with the publication date in the future would be listed. So let's have a look at how we can address that. If we switch over to our views module, we can remember that in the last video we covered how we worked with a generic view, specifically here for the index view, to return a list of the last 5 published questions. And we need to amend this so that we are also checking the date compared to the current date, and then only display those questions which do not have a publication date in the future. So to update that, we are first going to import the time zone module from Django utils, and then we need to update our getQuerySet method, and we're going to use the filter method to filter for the questions with a publication date that is larger than or equal to the current time zone. And for that we can use _LTE, which stands for larger than or equal than, and checks our database that we only include those questions, and then those questions will still be ordered by the publication date in reverse order, and we're limiting the result to the last 5 published questions. Now that we fixed that issue, we of course also should include tests in order to ensure that this works properly. For that we head back over to our tests.py file and we need to import the reverse method from django.urls. And then we can go ahead and we can create a new helper function here called createQuestion, and that's going to help us avoid some duplication in our code. Just below that we are going to create a new class, questionIndexViewTests. Again, this also needs to inherit from test case, and then we test different cases. So for instance, test no questions. Here we are testing that if there are no questions that exist, a message should be displayed. So here we are first using our reverse method to get the page for the parse index. Then we assert that the response code that we get back, the HTTP code, should be code 200 so that everything works properly. Then we also assert that the response should be equal to no polls are available to the text that we provided. And we are also checking that we actually don't have any questions listed, so that we have an empty list when we call context and we pass the latest question list as a key to this. We are also testing the case for past questions. So this means that questions with a publication date in the past should be regularly listed. And we're also testing the case for future questions. So specifically that questions with a publication date in the future aren't displayed on our index page. We also want to cover the case that if we have some questions which have a past publication date and some questions which have a future publication date, that only those questions with a past publication date are displayed. And then finally we're also testing here that if we have more than one question on the index page, that they are displayed properly in our method test2pastQuestions. So let's save those changes and let's head back to our terminal. And again, we can run the command to run our test case in the polls application. And here we can see that all 8 tests that we wrote ran properly. Now so far we ensured that questions with a future publication date are not displayed in the index view, but users might still be able to navigate to the detail page if they guess the URL correctly and see questions with a future publication date there. So to prevent that, we are going to update our detail view, and here we are going to add a getQuerySet method, which is going to exclude any questions that aren't published yet. So here we're using the filter method again, and we're using a very similar approach to filter only for those questions that have a publication date which is larger than or equal to the current time. And after adding that code, we should also test it. So therefore we can head over to our tests module. And here we are going to add an additional class called questionDetailViewTests, which includes the test for the detail view. And here we are adding 2 tests. First, we are going to test for future questions, so that a detailed view of a question with a publication date in the future returns a 404 error. And for that, we are going to use our createQuestion helper function again that we wrote before. We are checking for the URL, which is listed in our parse under the name detail. And as an argument, we pass the question ID to it. Then we get the URL and we check that we get a 404 error, because it should not be possible to access the detail page of a question with a future date, because that should not be published yet. And then we also ensure that questions with a past publication date are still displayed properly. So here we basically follow the same steps. The only difference is that this time here we are creating a new question with a publication date that's 5 days in the past rather than the future. And again, we are checking for the response. And this time we are expecting that we can actually access that page and that the correct question text will be displayed. And let's just make sure that this works properly. So again, we can switch over to our terminal and then run our tests again. Now we have a total of 10 tests and all of them pass without failure. So to briefly recap what we did, we first used the shell command to actually identify a bug. Then we accessed our tests module and we added a new test class inside of this file. And we added some tests to check that no questions with a future date are actually listed. We then ran our tests, identified that there was an issue and updated our models entry accordingly. And then we also learned how we can test our view. For that, we created a new test class, questionIndexViewTests. And again, we made sure that we inherited from the test case. We added the appropriate tests here. And then we also made sure that we updated our index view and detail view, generic view accordingly, and added tests for that as well. And we learned that in order to execute tests, we can head back to our terminal and use the command python manage_py tests polls to run our test suite. In the next video, we are going to cover how we can add images to our application and how we can style our application to make it look a bit nicer. Feel free to subscribe to the channel to stay up to date about new videos, and see you guys in the next video.